Je vous remercie. I first begin by apologizing for speaking in English. When the great scholar Vermont gave a speech in America, he spoke in French, and he said, even someone who knows no French will understand me better in French than if I speak English. I, in the reverse, think you will understand me better in English. So this is my topic. Now, I'm going to begin with a dilemma, wait a moment, concerning the nature of beauty. On the one hand, we often associate beauty with erotic attraction, as in the case of models and many actresses. On the other hand, as a category in aesthetics, beauty is understood to be a feature of artworks and sometimes natural phenomena, and is not necessarily understood as inspiring desire in the viewer. At least since Kant's critique of judgment, and I see we have Kant here on the wall, and even earlier, many critics have supposed that the proper response to artistic beauty is disinterested, that is, distant contemplation. So what, if anything, do these two conceptions of beauty have in common? Can they be reconciled, or is there a tension between them that obliges us to respond either one way or the other, as in the famous duck-rabbit image? You see, if you see this as the beak, this is the back of the head, it's a duck. If you look at this as the ears, this is the front, it's a rabbit. And you cannot see both at the same time. You always either see a duck or a rabbit. So that's the question. Now, since Roger Scruton, in a book published very recently called Beauty, puts the question very neatly, I'm taking the liberty of quoting him in this respect. He says, "There are no greater tributes to beauty than the medieval and Renaissance images of the Holy Virgin, a woman whose sexual maturity is expressed in motherhood and who yet remains untouchable, barely distinguishable as an object of veneration from the child in her arms." Now here's the critical thing. The Virgin's beauty is a symbol of purity, and for this very reason is held apart from the realm of sexual appetite, in a world of its own. And Scruton says this thought reaches back to Plato's original idea that beauty is not just an invitation to desire, but also a call to renounce it. This is supposed to be both in Plato, an invitation to desire and a summons to renounce desire. And so the beauty of a poem or an abstract sculpture is supposed to evoke something like admiration or even reverence, not erotic desire. As Scruton writes, and I quote him, "In the realm of art, beauty is an object of contemplation, not desire." Explicit. But if this is the case, what is there about beauty that arouses sexual desire? What's the connection? Scruton asks himself, does this mean that there are two kinds of beauty, the beauty of people and the beauty of art? He rejects the solution, and I'm inclined to agree with him, but the problem remains. For even if we agree that we react differently, or we might react differently, to the image of a beautiful woman in art, the Virgin Mary, let's say, and a beautiful woman or man in real life, why do we do so? What is there that holds us at a reverential distance in the case of the work of art? Scruton is alert to the issue, and he poses it in terms of the beauty of children. He writes, "There is hardly a person alive who is not moved by the beauty of a perfectly formed child. Yet most people are horrified by the thought that this beauty should be a spur to desire, other than the desire to cuddle and comfort the child. And yet, he says, the beauty of a child is of the same kind, I'm quoting him, as the beauty of a desirable adult, and totally unlike the beauty of an aged face. Now, I just parenthetically say, this is a point on which you can see why I disagree with him. Okay. Well, this is what he says. So, he's here putting aside the realm of art and differentiates two kinds of beauty with respect to the human form alone, suggesting that here too we recognize two kinds of appeal: the aged face or the venerable virgin who's like a child, and the child's beauty. Now, we may want to ask, is the beauty of a child exactly the same as the beauty of an adult? And we will come back to that in a moment. But before we do, I want to examine a case that makes Scruton's problem, the problem of the attractiveness of a woman and yet the need to make a certain distance, clear by taking an example from a particular work of art. In a book called A Cultural History of Pain, it originally came out in Spanish, called Historia Cultural del Dolor, Javier Moscoso asks, how do we know when there's someone else is in pain? That's the question. And he says, we may infer it if we see somebody, let's say instruments of torture. We assume the person is in pain, but what if that individual is actually insensitive to pain? How would we know? We have pictures of Christian martyrs who look like they are in a state of joy even when they are, or at least indifferent, even when they are suffering, and many ancient narratives that explain this in detail. Now, one illustration on which Moscoso dwells is a retablo. It's an altarpiece, the painting by the altar, in a town in the area of Valladolid in Spain. The church is long since destroyed, but the images that were painted in the 16th century are now preserved in the Museum of Fine Art in Oviedo, in Asturias. And let's see if they can work. Okay, this is the painting. As you can see, there are 6 panels on top which illustrate the story I'm about to tell you, and then 12 panels on top, and then the 6 panels below are scenes from the life of Christ. So we're looking at the top set. Okay, now, the story on the top is of Saint Marina. Saint Marina was martyred in Turkey, parts of the area of Turkey, in the 3rd century. She was the daughter of a pagan priest named Odysseus, who was the first one to persecute her after she adopted the Christian faith. After that, her beauty attracted the attention of Olymbrius, the local Roman governor, who was prepared to marry her if she gave up her faith. Well, now you see the story. The Roman governor is the bad guy who's in love with her, but will marry her, but only if she gives up her Christian faith. Of course, Marina refuses, and Olymbrius subjected her to terrible tortures, which each one miraculously failed to change her beauty. And after each episode, she comes out still beautiful, until in the end, he has her killed by the sword. Well, that's Marina's story. Moscoso writes, as opposed to the prefect, that's the Roman governor, Marina's beauty depends on her strength of spirit and not on the configuration of her body. Let's think about that. It depends on her spirit and not her body. Her tranquility contrasts with the enraged and deformed faces of the torturers who are torturing her. Now he says, I'm still quoting him, the altarpiece exalts the spiritual beauty of the young woman by way of her body, which reappears intact and unaltered at the end of every torment and returns to its natural state after every blow. Her beauty, which is a constant point of reference in literary characterizations and pictorial representations. I'm still quoting Bocco. Her beauty turns her body into a witness of the truth and a tabernacle of salvation. Tabernacle is an old-fashioned word. It's literally a tent, but she's a tabernacle of salvation. Her body turns her beauty into a witness of the truth. Now, what interests me in this narrative and the pictures is the double role that is assigned to Marina's beauty, because here we see the problem. On the one hand, it is her beauty that arouses the desire of the Roman governor Olymbrius. So this is clearly ordinary physical beauty. She is erotically attractive. She has to be erotically attractive. The governor hasn't fallen in love with her because of her spiritual beauty or her tabernacle of salvation. That's not what the governor wants. The governor doesn't want any tabernacles. He wants her. Tabernacle is such an ugly word anyway. But on the other hand, her beauty is evidently, at least in Moscoso's view, supposed to be a spiritual kind of beauty, the kind that invites contemplation. And Scruton says, not an invitation to desire, but a call to renounce it. So in itself, Marina's beauty produces both effects. What is it that makes us, as readers of the story or as viewers of the pictures, respond to her in a posture and an attitude of reverence when we see her beauty, not very visible here, but later I'll show you different images, rather than with sexual desire? Why don't we, when we read about her, why do we not respond like the governor? Why do we respond in a different way? What makes the difference? That's the question. So, the theme of the Christian who is persecuted not only because of a refusal to acknowledge pagan gods or the divinity of the emperor, but also to submit to the sexual demands of a powerful agent, that's a popular one in classical antiquity. And just for the fun of it, I'll tell you one more such story. It was, this is called the so-called Acts of Xanthippe and Polyxena, which dates probably to the 5th century. So it's a little later than Marina's martyrdom, although the Marina story is later. Okay, in this case, Polyxena, a beautiful young woman, dreams that she has been rescued from the jaws of a dragon by a handsome youth, and that's evidently an image of Christ. She is then abducted, carried off from her native Spain by a vicious man who is a rival to her suitor. So we have Polyxena, we have a suitor who wants to marry her, and then we have the rival who carries her off from Spain. And in the course of her adventures, she crosses paths with 4 apostles. So she's a lucky lady. 4 apostles. First of all, she lands in Greece, where the apostle Philip rescues her and hands her over to the care of a holy man. The abductor follows her, not at all upset, and he raises an army of 8,000 men to recapture the girl, but they are defeated by 30 servants. In the meantime, Polyxena escapes. She then encounters a lioness who spares her on the grounds that she has not yet been baptized. I love this. The lioness won't kill her because she hasn't been baptized yet, and therefore she won't go to heaven. So, very nice. And but then she receives baptism at the hands of the apostle Andrew. Later, a kindly ass driver tells Polyxena to adopt the appearance of a man so that her beauty may not attract unwanted attention. This is a very common theme. You dress up as someone, a man, or in some other disguise, a beggar, so that your attractiveness will not. This is obviously not a spiritual attractiveness, the carnal attractiveness. But a wicked prefect, here we are back with the wicked prefect, sees her and carries her off. He calls her to his bed, but Polyxena manages to convince his servants to pretend she has a fever. In the meantime, the son of the prefect, who has been converted to Christianity, by whom? By St. Paul and Thecla. We've got a really prominent cast of characters here. Conspires to escape with Polyxena to Spain, back to Spain. Their plan is discovered, and the governor throws the two of them, Polyxena and his own son, to the lions. But the lioness that is sent out against them simply licks their feet. I suppose this is the same one that spared her before, even though she's now been baptized, so he'd have a good reason to kill her, but no, he doesn't. At this point, it's a miracle. The governor and all the population convert to Christianity, and they transport the children back to Spain, where the abductor is about to take her off again, but then he too is converted to Christianity and is baptized by St. Paul along with the suitor. Now, this tale has many elements in common with ancient Greek novels, in which an adolescent boy and girl of exceptional beauty fall in love with one another, are forcibly separated, and in the course of many misadventures are assailed, attacked by rivals who are smitten, who are stricken by their almost divine good looks. They remain, in spite of all these dangers, faithful to one another, and in the end, they are reunited. However, and here's the point, neither in these novels, nor in the story of Polyxena, is the beauty of the protagonist treated as a symbol of virtue or spiritual purity. The beauty is simply an object of erotic attention. It is not at the same time symbolic of virtue. In fact, quite the opposite. Beauty is very often seen as the contrary of virtue or saintliness. Now, the strong association between beauty and sexual attraction in these texts is no surprise, given the prevailing conception of beauty in the classical period. However, the classical attitude toward beauty has been obscured, I am claiming. Now, right here we have people in the audience, including my dear friend Pierre, who aren't completely convinced of my argument. And I say this because I want you to listen to my argument with a critical mind. I could very well be wrong. I differ with Pierre only with much trepidation. So, and as soon as I'm finished, you'll see why. But I have argued that there's a confusion concerning the classical vocabulary in ancient Greek. The word that is most commonly taken to mean beautiful is, let's see if we can get this to work. No, you see, it hasn't done it. Let me just see again. I'm hitting the right button, but it doesn't do it. What have I done wrong? You know, I hit these buttons and it doesn't. Yeah? You see what I mean? This doesn't do it. It doesn't move to the next one. I want, no, not this one, earlier. No, you see, they were back at the end of that's at the end. I want to keep going back. All the surprises going, but okay. One more, two more. No, one more. That's it. It sort of fades out after a while when I don't use it. Okay, this is what okay, now this is the word, kalos. You notice there's one L, and the accent is on that O, second syllable. And that's the word, and the word for beautiful, or beauty, that's the word beautiful, adjective. And the word for beauty is the beautiful. And very often you read that in translations. And to is Greek for the, and kalon is the neuter of kalos, the beautiful, to kalon. Both times, one lambda, accent on the second syllable. Now, the problem with this word is that it means many things. Sometimes it can mean beautiful, but very often, really most often, it means something more like fine, noble, or virtuous. So it's applied to well-made clothing, where the idea isn't that it's beautiful, but that it's well-made, or to such things as human character or even laws. So, and in this phrase, to kalon, the beautiful, is translated in, let's say, the standard English-Greek dictionary as beauty, but also as virtue and honor. To illustrate the nature of the problem, I'm going to mention an article that came out a few years ago in a special issue of a classical journal, which was dedicated to the idea of beauty, harmony, and the good. Okay, the author is a very fine scholar named Aryeh Kosman. Colleagues here will know. And he's talking about Aristotle's use of the term kalos or kalon, and he says it will cause perplexity only to the extent that we translate kalon as beautiful and tokalon as the beautiful, and as beauty. And he says, he gives courage as an example. He says, Aristotle says that a person who is courageous for the sake of the kalon. Now, he doesn't mean he's courageous because of the sake of the beauty. He's courageous because of the noble. That's Kosman's explanation, and he says it's right. And he writes, I quote, "There is a deep history of uncertainty about how to translate kalon." And he concludes that the ambiguities associated with this term, and now I quote him, "leave me with the urge," and then he says, "an urge that I will of course resist," to say that the Greeks had no concept of beauty. And he goes on to say, "But this much is right. The concept of beauty is sufficiently different from that of the kalon to make my urge understandable." So here's a professional philosopher of ancient Greek wondering whether there is even a concept of beauty in classical antiquity. And in his recent book, A History of Beauty, Umberto Eco says, I quote, "In fact, beauty had no autonomous stature in ancient Greece. There was no autonomous conception of beauty. The very word kalon," he writes, "which only improperly may be translated as beauty, ought to put us on our guard." We ought to be aware. Now, the absence of a specific term doesn't mean that the concept was missing, but it does make it very difficult to isolate what the Greeks thought beauty was. Now, what I argue in my book is that there was, in fact, a word that came much closer to the modern conception of beauty, and that was the very similar, this time it worked. Notice the difference. 2 lambdas and the accent on the first syllable. So when I speak it, I'm going to say kalos instead of kalos. Kalos instead of kalos. Now, they're obviously the same root. Clearly the same root. And, but what happens as often in a case is that words of the same root, this is a noun, the other one was an adjective, can differ in their usage. I give the example in English, emerge, which is, I suppose, emerger, and emergency. And you know they're different kinds of meanings. In English, we have a word fine, meaning kind of good, excellent, and then we have finery. Finery refers specifically to clothing. It can't mean anything else. She was dressed in her finery means she had her finest clothing. You don't use it for any other purpose. So those are places where words very similar can differ in meaning, and what I discovered, and here the author, the person to whom you must hold responsible for anything good and also anything bad that I have to say is Pierre. The reason is Pierre invited me to contribute a chapter to his book on, he's editing a book on ancient aesthetics on beauty. And I wrote back and I said, I have no idea what to write and I can't do it. And Pierre said 2 times, 5 times, yes, you must. And as I was worrying about it, it occurred to me that this word kalos, just from my reading, it was different from kalos. I had an intuition, what we call in English a hunch. And so I decided to track it down and see whether it was true. And that is the source of this entire book. And I make that very clear in the preface, that he's got all the responsibility. If you don't like it, you know whom to blame. Okay, now, I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations of the kind of thing that occurred to me. So in the Iliad, let's just take Homer because it's such a standard place. Who gets to be called beautiful? Now, remember this is a noun, so I have to say who possesses kalos? To whom is kalos ascribed? You can almost guess. Well, the heroine is going to be Helen. Absolutely. But whom does Helen fall in love with? Paris. He gets beauty. Who else? You remember the boy that Zeus carries off to heaven, Ganymede? He gets beauty. Who else? There's a very interesting situation where Bellerophon is described as possessing beauty. But what is Bellerophon's story? He is a guest at the home of a king, and the king's wife falls in love with Bellerophon. So you already see what the structure of kalos is in the Iliad. When somebody is beautiful, someone else falls in love with them. In the Odyssey, you have a story. Odysseus gets to be made beautiful. He's given beauty by Athena. When? He lands on the land of the Phaeacians, you remember, and the princess Nausicaa comes down. She's marriageable. She is washing her garments for her wedding, and she sees Odysseus come out of the water. He's been swimming for days. He's covered with barnacles. He looks hideous. Athena wants to make him attractive so that Nausicaa will think of him as a potential husband and rescue him. And that's exactly what happens. She gets enchanted by him. As she leads him back to the city, she tells him, wait behind, because I don't want the men up on the walls to think I have found a husband from a foreign land. In other words, the theme of erotic attractiveness is built in. Who is not given beauty in the Iliad? Everyone else. Ajax, Diomedes, Hector, never. Not a hint of it. So when you look at, now, if we were looking at the other adjective, that, of course, they all are noble. They're all noble, but they don't possess this, or it is not ascribed to them. And in one interesting example, we have, I found a number of these cases where a writer, this is Theocritus in this case, says of a boy, the ancients, they thought boys were attractive and they thought women were attractive. But boys and women, and so they often said, which is better to fall in love with? And there were arguments both ways. Boys were nobler, but when a woman grows older, she may still be physically attractive. But when boys grew older, they were imagined that they assumed the active role as lover rather than as beloved. And so they would lose their kalos. So Theocritus says the kalos of a boy is kalon, but it only lasts a short time. So what does he mean? He doesn't mean the beauty of a boy is beautiful. He means the beauty of a boy is a fine thing, but short-lived. So you want to prefer, in that particular context, women. Now, just to give you, when the Greeks of the classical period began to think more in terms of pederastic love, it would become the beloved boy was beautiful, but the lover, it would be awkward to judge the lover as having beauty, because this would suggest that he was the object of attraction. And if you ascribed beauty to an adult male, it was often almost an insult. So Alcibiades, characters who are morally dubious, will exploit their beauty even when they are adults. Similarly, of the goddesses, we think of Artemis or Athena as having beauty, but not this word, because this word suggests erotic attractiveness, and you don't really want to ascribe it only in certain special circumstances to these goddesses. Now, more does happen with this conception. When the Greeks came to be thinking about what made something beautiful, why did something have kalos, they started to think in terms of proportion and symmetry. And this is a picture of the spear bearer. Here's another one. They're Roman adaptations, so the shapes are slightly different. But let's look at the earlier one, perhaps. In any case, Polyclitus, and now here I'm speaking, we have Alicia Montemayor in the audience, and she is the expert from whom I learned an enormous amount of things on this topic. She did her dissertation in the in the Mexican University on the fragments of the person who built this, who's named Polyclitus, but he also wrote a treatise called the Canon, the measure, the yardstick, in which he described the proportions that you needed to make a work like this beautiful. The head would be such and such a percentage of the rest of the body, the hand, this much of the arm, the whole forearm, this much of the whole arm. Everything was mathematically calculated. And then he illustrated his calculations in a statue that he made. So he both wrote a book, or a little pamphlet, and the statue. The thing is that nothing in these proportions suggests that beauty was associated particularly with virtue. However, it did come to be associated with non-material or non-physical things. And the main person responsible is Plato. Plato, looking to abbreviate this a bit, but very briefly, Plato felt the attraction of erotic attraction very strongly. He has his hero Socrates say, and you remember that Socrates claimed that he knew nothing. And the only way in which he was wiser than anyone else is that he knew nothing, whereas everybody else thought they knew something, and so they were mistaken. But in several dialogues, Socrates does claim, I am an expert in one thing, erotics. He knows about erotic attraction. And and you know how many of the dialogues are concerned with interest in boys, the association with boys. He saw in boys beauty. He thinks primarily of boys in this context, or beauty at all. He sees in the individual beauty a sign of something that goes beyond itself. And when, in the symposium he explains, you see one person's beauty and you are thrilled with it, you soon realize that two things. One, this beauty is unstable, not only because it will pass, but put it in a different light, look at it from a different direction, and it loses its quality as beauty. In addition, it's not unique to this individual. Once the passion goes, you see many people are beautiful. And so gradually what you do is you form an idea of beauty which is neither alterable, it's uniform and stays the way it is forever, and at the same time, it's not one person's beauty or another. It's instantiated in the beauty of these individuals, but itself, it's a beauty as beauty itself. Now, Plato's term is the noun kalos. He is talking about this. And he says it is this beauty, the higher beauty, that draws us to it. And what draws us to the higher beauty? And here's where the clue is. It's eros. It is passion. Plato feels that we are passionately drawn to the ideal transcendental world of the forms, what he calls the ideas or the forms. This is a critical point, that even though Plato has created such an abstract notion of beauty, he nevertheless does not ever separate it from the notion of erotic attraction. He continues to use the concept of eros as the thing that draws us to it. And I will give as an example, just very briefly, because I won't go into detail, a brief quotation from the Neoplatonic writer Plotinus. Plotin, you would say in French. Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century after Christ, and he has an essay among his multiple essays called On Beauty. It's an essay on beauty. It's actually the earliest of the essays that he wrote, and he explains how we go from the perceptible visual objects, which are the most commonly, he says in the common language, are called beautiful, and we rise up to higher and higher abstractions until you get to the ideal beauty itself. And when you do perceive that beauty, and now I quote Plotinus in a translation not my own, so that it's a standard translation, you can see how it is. He says, anyone who will know that vision, the vision of beauty, with what passion of love will he not be seized? With what pang, that means like an ache, of desire? With what longing to be melted into one with that beauty? Now that idea of being melted into one is standard language of erotic vocabulary in Greece. He says, with what wondering delight he loves with a veritable love, with sharp desire. All other loves than this he must despise and disdain everything that once seemed fair. So you see how powerful an expression of erotic attraction toward this one beautiful thing is. Now, I think I still have a bit of time here. How are we going to understand then the puzzle that was posed in connection with Saint Marina? Are we to see her beauty or the beauty of the Virgin as an emanation of beauty itself? That kind of, are we going to be seized by a passion of love, a pang of desire, a longing to be molten into one? Imagine now you're looking at the image of the Virgin and taking it as an image of ideal spiritual beauty. Is that the effect? Will Plotinus, in other words, help us with the dilemma that we had? I have illustrated this story, there we are, with this image, who I think is a beautiful woman. One moment. Have to get the right page here. Yeah. That's the Virgin Mary in it was called the Virgin Mary of Macarena. She's in Seville, in the city of Seville, and Holy Week. Some of you may know that there are these penitential processions. Very impressive. Groups of people going all through the day and night, dressed as follows. Oh, it's stuck again. Let me just see if I can do it this way. There we go. I got it now. I figured it out. This is what the procession looks like. And these are the floats, which are carried by men. And on them you will have, most typically, an image of Jesus and an image of the Virgin. And sometimes some other scenes as well. And as they march along, there are people watching from both sides, others marching in the procession. These are dressed in the penitents' hoods and gowns. You don't want to show your face when you're a penitent because that could suggest pride. And you don't want to, the one thing you don't want to do when you're repenting is to pretend that you're better than the next guy who isn't repenting as much as you are. So, and they're watching also from the balconies. And occasionally, someone actually from the balconies, they're inspired to deliver a song. It's a spontaneous composition to the Virgin, always to the Virgin. And from the sides, you will hear people screaming, guapa. And I love that word guapa because guapa, it's characteristic of Peninsula Spain, not so much in Mexico, it would be linda. But they call it guapa, and guapa has a special characteristic. It's only used of human beings. You'd never say a landscape is guapa, you'd never say a work of art is. Linda, yes, but not, that's what Spanish has a special word, Peninsula Spanish, that's only for human beings. So they're calling her beautiful. Now, what do they mean? Are they referring to her spiritual beauty? Do they think that she is simply beautiful in the way that, I would almost be inclined to think that that image of her is beautiful as any woman is beautiful. And if it is so, then what keeps her in a separate realm apart from desire? Is it there's a different kind of beauty? Is it that we are called to renounce desire by the very image of beauty as Scruton thinks, Plato thinks? Or is it that they recognize her beauty as the same kind of beauty as any beautiful woman or man would have, but one that we do not feel sexually attracted to, not because it's a different beauty, but because sometimes we know it's inappropriate. We may see we have a beautiful mother, a beautiful sister, or a beautiful wife of a friend, and we repress or hold at a distance our erotic attraction, not because we don't recognize it, but because that's the circumstances under which we keep it under control. Just to give you an example of the kind of problem that this raises, I mentioned very, very briefly a representation from the 16th century of the decapitation of Holofernes by Judith. Maybe some of you remember from the book of Judith in the Bible, Judith was a beautiful Jewish widow who entered the camp of Holofernes, the general, who, as he was preparing to fight the Jews and force them to worship Nebuchadnezzar. That's the story. She entered the tent, seduced the general, and when she got him drunk, she cut off his head. With the result, now that they didn't have their general, that the Jews defeated Holofernes' army. So the tale, like that of Marina, makes no sense unless we assume that Judith's beauty is not only spiritual. After all, that's not what attracted Holofernes. So how do you paint them? Here's a picture by Jan Massis, painted in the year 1543, and now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I don't even comment. You see the problem. Is that spiritual beauty? Is that a tabernacle by way of her body of salvation? Well, there's Holofernes. Okay, the story. Well, I want to conclude now, and I am just on the point of concluding, with one possible alternative way of viewing the question of beauty in aesthetics. And that has to do with the idea that perhaps let's retreat now from a person being beautiful and take up the idea that in a work of art, beauty is different from what it is in ordinary life, the problem that was raised by Scruton, because a work of art possesses a kind of beauty that's independent of the subject that is represented. When we thought about that statue of Polykleitos that he made, that statue of the spear bearer, he gave us all the proportions. But what were the proportions meant to tell us? Were they meant to tell us that a statue with those proportions was beautiful, or that a human figure with those proportions was beautiful, and then when made into a statue, of course the statue is beautiful. What it means is the statue is beautiful because the figure is beautiful. It means nothing more than that. So there's no contrast. Here's a picture of the so-called blue nude. How do you say it in French? La nude bleue? I don't know. Something like that. By Matisse. And it was done in the same year as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of Picasso. Actually, Matisse did his first. Picasso hated it. And 6 months later, he painted his own, and then he and Matisse became great friends. So it really was Matisse's influence on Picasso that turned him in the direction of that kind of painting. Now, the question is that a beautiful work of art? Is it a beautiful work of art? Alexander Nehemas, in his recent book called The Promise of Happiness, The Place of Beauty in a World of Art, says it is a beautiful work. He insists on it. But this very distinguished art critic, Arthur Danto, writes, he says, the Blue Nude is a good painting, even a great painting. And then he adds, but anyone who says it is beautiful, and here's an English expression meaning to speak nonsense, is speaking through his hat. That's an English expression, means it's speaking nonsense. Anyone who says this is a beautiful painting is speaking. Why? Because that's not a beautiful figure. And you cannot have a beautiful painting when the object of the painting is not beautiful itself. Now this is Danto, writing in 2003, one of the most eminent art critics and philosophers we have. I don't quote him to show that he's right or that he's wrong, only that that the controversy is still very much alive. Scruton, whom I've been quoting before, says, if you have a photograph of an ugly object, then the photograph cannot be called beautiful. So this is a very standard opinion of a complex point of view. Well, should we? Matisse himself said, if I ever saw a woman coming down the street who looked like someone in one of my paintings, I would faint. So he was not surprised that there should be controversy of this sort. So how do we conclude? Should we say that it's beautiful? Should we say that it's not beautiful? Or perhaps should we think rather that a problem emerging in English aesthetic vocabulary, beginning in the 18th century, doesn't apply to the way the Greeks looked at beauty? I have never found a Greek who asked the question of whether a representation of an ugly object can be called beautiful as a work of art. And I don't think it's because they were ignorant of the possibility, it's that the term wouldn't have occurred to them because this woman would not possess kalos in ancient Greek. He would not ascribe it to her because she doesn't look like the ideal beautiful woman any more than they would, let's say, in these paintings. And so they would say, it could be well made, it could be colorful, it could be interesting, it could be morally educative, it could be a better or worse technically evolved thing, but beauty would be independent of this question. It's not, neither the figures in it, nor of course the work of art itself, is erotically attractive. So their vocabulary tended to distinguish between what we think of as erotic beauty and well-made, fine, excellent in many of its other senses. So my conclusion really is that paying attention to the Greeks' way of thinking will not replace our own conceptions of beauty. It's not meant to. We have our own heritage and our own understanding of beauty, but our notion of beauty, where beauty becomes the sole term of appreciation when it comes to art and aesthetics, that was a particular development in our own culture, and it leads to contradictions, tensions, problems that did not arise in the way the Greeks formulated beauty and their own vocabulary, and that we stand to gain something, not by imitating the way the Greeks thought, but at least by taking it very seriously. Thank you.